Hey there, econ students. This is a short lesson on international trade, and in particular, we'll look at the concept of absolute and comparative advantage. The point of this lesson is to illustrate the benefits of countries working together to maximize their production of goods rather than trying to produce everything for themselves. So, first thing that you find in this lesson that would come out of our textbook is some terms to be familiar with. The first term is absolute advantage. So when a country can produce more of a good than another country can produce with the same quantity of resources, that first country is said to have an absolute advantage in producing that good. So when a country specializes, however, in the production of a good, it's only producing that one good. And when a country can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than that of another country, that country is said to have a comparative advantage. What that means is you could have two countries with same types of resources available, and one country might be better for reasons, many different reasons, but one example could be that maybe their workforce is just more efficient at producing a good than another country's workforce is. So even though they have the same amount of labor, if one country is a little better at their labor is actually a little better, they're going to have a comparative advantage in producing the good. And the next thing we're going to do is look at it in a micro perspective. So let's just think about two people and how they might have an absolute or comparative advantage with each other and what that means for their production. So Stacy and Travis, when opportunity costs here, both produce garden ornaments. And remember, opportunity cost was also from level 1, including bamboo and wind chimes or wooden birdhouses. Stacy and Travis make the wind chimes and birdhouses by assembling parts manufactured by other people. The following table shows the number of wind chimes and birdhouses that Stacy and Travis can make in 1 hour. So according to the chart, if Stacy spends an hour making wind chimes, she can make 3 wind chimes. If she spends a whole hour making birdhouses, she can make 1 birdhouse. Travis, on the other hand, if he spends an hour making wind chimes, he can make 2, or if he spends a whole hour making birdhouses, he can make 3. So now we look at these questions and we could respond to them. When Stacy spends 1 hour making 3 wind chimes, because that's the amount she can make in an hour, she's giving up the opportunity to make 1 birdhouse, because that's the amount she can make in the hour as well. So for Stacy, her opportunity cost of making the wind chime is how many birdhouses. And you remember back when we did Mama Bear and Papa Bear, we had to set production equal to each other. So for Stacy, in this case, for her 3 wind chimes is the equivalent in terms of time as 1 birdhouse. So her opportunity cost of making a wind chime, divide these sides out by 3, is 1/3 of a birdhouse. So in the time that it takes her to make one wind chime, which is about 20 minutes according to the chart, it's 20 minutes she couldn't spend building a birdhouse. And in that 20 minutes, she normally could produce about 1/3 of a birdhouse. When Stacy spends an hour making one birdhouse, she gives up the opportunity to make 3 wind chimes. So the opportunity cost for her there is 3 wind chimes, because it takes her the full hour to make that 1 birdhouse, whereas in that hour she could be making 3 wind chimes. Now when Travis spends 1 hour making, let's see on the chart, he can make 2 wind chimes. He gives up the opportunity to make 3 birdhouses. So for Travis, his opportunity cost of making a wind chime, which he can make 2 of, or he could be making 3 birdhouses, and we want to know what's the opportunity cost for making a wind chime. So we're going to reduce the wind chime side down to 1, is 3/2, which is the same as 1.5 or 1.5 birdhouses. And when he spends an hour making 3 birdhouses, he gives up the opportunity to make 2 wind chimes. So in this case, his opportunity cost, and I'll actually do the calculations here for you. Now we want to solve for B, or birdhouses, this time, so it's got to work this way. The cost of one birdhouse is 2/3 of a wind chime. So if we want to take our responses that we had this, these are our opportunity costs, right? I've highlighted them for Stacy and Travis. The opportunity cost of making a wind chime for Stacy was 1/3, and for Travis it was 1.5. So 1/3, 1.5. Okay, the opportunity cost of birdhouses for Stacy and Travis. Let's see, for Stacy it's 3. For Travis, it's 2/3. So now looking at this chart, we should be able to determine who has the comparative advantage in making wind chimes. In other words, it's saying who is giving up the least when they make a wind chime. So if we focus over here and we look at our two responses, Stacy is the least costly because she only sacrifices the opportunity to make 1/3 of a birdhouse, whereas when Travis makes a wind chime, it's way more costly because you're giving up the opportunity to make 1.5 birdhouses in that time it takes to make the wind chime. So Stacy has the comparative advantage. Stacy has, and she has the lower opportunity cost. Remember, opportunity cost is what you otherwise would have done. And who has the comparative advantage in making the birdhouses? Well, if we look at that more closely, you can see Travis is less costly. His opportunity cost is only 2/3 of a wind chime, whereas Stacy's opportunity cost to make a birdhouse is 3 wind chimes. In this case, Travis has the lower opportunity cost. So then we might be asked the question, well, should we have them specialize and produce what they're best at? Or should we have them each producing wind chimes and birdhouses? So if we're asking who should specialize in making the wind chimes, we want it to be Stacy. Because she has the comparative advantage. Stacy has the comparative, and I'm just going to abbreviate that as competitive advantage. And who should specialize in making birdhouses then is Travis, because he has the comparative advantage. And so if they don't specialize, and Stacy spends 1 hour making wind chimes and an hour making birdhouses, according to the chart, she can make, go back to it, 3 wind chimes and 1 birdhouse in an hour. In those 2 hours, I should say. But if she specializes and spends both hours making wind chimes, 2 times 3, she can make 6 wind chimes in 2 hours rather than 3 wind chimes and 1 birdhouse. And we know Travis, if he spends an hour making wind chimes, he'll make 2, and if he spends the other hour making birdhouses, he'll make 3 of those. 2 wind chimes, 3 birdhouses. But if he specializes and spends both hours making birdhouses, well, then we know he can make 6 birdhouses. So if they do not specialize and each spends 1 hour making wind chimes and 1 hour making birdhouses, then together they can produce how many wind chimes? Well, if they only spend an hour doing it, they will produce 5 wind chimes. And they will produce 4 birdhouses. But if they specialize and they each spend 2 hours working in the area where they have the comparative advantage, then together you can see they're going to be able to produce more. They're going to be able to produce 6 wind chimes and 6 birdhouses. And that certainly is better than 5 and 4. Now, suppose we look at it from the perspective of the business. If they decide to specialize in producing a product, what might be the results of their specialization? Well, I'd say 3 things. 1, they could be more wisely utilizing their resources. They don't have to make decisions based on scarcity of how do we use our labor resource to produce one thing and how much of it do we use to produce something else and have to change that. They can put all of their effort towards producing that one thing they're best at. They can seek more productive labor workers because they know exactly what they're looking for in workers. They don't need as diverse a worker to be able to do that. And they should be able to maximize their productivity. If we think back to the PPF, they're going to be able to push out towards that curve and be as productive, hopefully, as they possibly can be. So that might be the results of specialization, or that would be the hope. Now, if we want to look at it from a country's perspective, we're going to suppose 2 nations. There's Smithville and Jonesland, and they can produce wheat or rice. And the following table shows the combinations of the 2 goods that the country can produce with the same amount of resources. So the first thing we're asked is, which country has the absolute advantage in producing wheat? So when we focus in on when each country produces only wheat, we're going to look at Smithville, we're going to look at Jonesland. When they're making only wheat, Smithville can make 90 units of wheat. Jonesland can make 15. So absolute is just implying overall number, looking at the 2 countries, who's better at producing wheat. And so 90 is better than 15. So Smithville. And right below, I'm just going to say that 90 units of wheat is greater than Jonesland's 15 units of wheat. So that's my way of noting that. Which country has the absolute advantage in producing rice? So when we look at Smithville and Jonesland, and we look at what happens when they're only producing rice, that's down here with combination D, where they're using all their resources towards that. And Jonesland's producing 15 again. So it turns out that Smithville is better at producing both. So Smithville, because 30 is greater than the 15 that Jonesland can produce. Now, we're even going to be asked comparative advantage, though. This might tell us a different story. Which country has the comparative advantage in producing wheat? In order to do that, we should look at what it costs each country. So let's start with Smithville. And we know that when they're producing wheat or rice, these are their 2 things that, 2 extremes, right? Either they can use all their resources to produce wheat or rice, and if they do that, they can get 90 units of wheat if they use it all for wheat, or they can get 30 units of rice if they use everything for rice. And then there's combinations in between, obviously, but we're looking at the extremes. So 90 units of wheat is the equivalent of 30 units of rice for Smithville. So I'm going to write that down. And Jonesland when we look at their combinations here, if they are choosing I apologize for that. they are choosing only wheat, they can make 15. If they're choosing only rice, they can make 15. So 15 units of wheat is the equivalent of producing 15 units of rice, depending on how they want to use the resources. So now we're looking for the comparative advantage in producing wheat. So we want to know, when we are looking at 1 unit of wheat, how many units of rice are we giving up? So to do that, we have to divide both sides by 90. So for Smithville, 1 unit of wheat is the equivalent of 30 over 90, which is the same as a third a unit of rice. For Jonesland, we want to get wheat reduced down to 1, so we divide both sides by 15, and it makes a really easy reduction because in Jonesland, 1 unit of wheat is the equivalent of 1 unit of rice, whereas in Smithville, that's not the case. So Smithville has the comparative advantage because it's less costly, right? They only give up a third unit of rice to make a unit of wheat, whereas Jonesland has to give up a full unit of rice. So now we can look at the same question here, and which country has the comparative advantage in producing rice? Well, if we stay with Smithville being here, and let's abbreviate Smithville, 90 units of wheat, the equivalent of 30 units of rice. We want to isolate rice, figure it out per unit. What does rice cost us to make? So these cancel out, and now we're left with 90 over 30, which is the same as 90 divided by 30 is 3. So the unit of rice is the equivalent of 3 units of wheat. That's pretty costly for Smithville. Jonesland, 15 units of wheat, the equivalent of 15 units of rice. Divide both sides by 15. You're left with the same result as before, right? It's a 1-to-1 comparison, so that's the cost. Well, now, the comparative advantage when you look at these two countries actually lies with Jonesland, because 1 unit of rice is less than, or 1 unit of wheat, I should say, is less than 3 units of wheat. So Jonesland actually has the comparative advantage because Smithville has to give up more when it grows rice. So now we're presented a scenario to show that specializing in trading is going to work better for these countries than if they try to do things on their own. So let's assume that they're producing a little bit of both for each other. Smithville is producing combination B, and they just got that from up on this chart up here. They're using B. Right. And Jonesland is using combination F from that chart above. And so Smithville currently is making 60 units of wheat and 10 units of rice. Jonesland, 10 units of wheat, 5 units of rice. But suppose they decide to specialize in the good, and each has a comparative advantage in, and then they're going to trade with one another. And the country that's producing the wheat is going to give 20 units to the other, and the country that's producing rice is going to give 10 units of rice back in return for those 20 units of wheat. So we want Smithville is going to produce the wheat because they have the competitive or comparative advantage. And Jonesland's going to produce the rice. And when they make it, let's see, Smithville uses all of it. That's 90 units of wheat. And we know Jonesland can make 15 units of rice. So let's go back to the chart. We look at when they are producing only one or the other, that's what they're making, right, when they specialize. So after specializing in trading, Smithville is going to be producing 90 units of wheat, but they're going to trade away 20 units of it. Right, so that's going to leave them with 70. And in return for that 20 that they gave away, they're getting 10 units back of rice. And Jonesland, they are getting 20 units of wheat from Smithville because they're not growing any, trading for it. And it's going to leave them with, let's see, they're giving away 10 units, so they're going to have 5 units of rice left over. Now let's show how they are more productive and have more food for the people in their country because they specialized and traded. Smithville has Well, let's see, in the original question, they had 60 units of wheat, but after specializing trading, they're at 70. So they have 10 more units of wheat. And in terms of rice, they have 10 units of rice, and that's what they had before. So they have no more units of rice, but they don't have any less. They didn't have to give anything up to get 10 more units of wheat. Jonesland has 20 units of wheat now because they traded, whereas before they only had 10, so they went up by 10. And they stayed at 5 for both, so they didn't get any more units of rice, but they didn't have to give anything up to get more wheat. So specializing in trading benefited both countries. So this is just mathematical evidence showing how international trade and specialization can be good when resources are utilized productively and countries are willing and open to trade fairly with each other and voluntarily. The last two questions here just ask about outsourcing and offshoring, and you may hear the term outsourcing. It's simply when one firm pays another to do work for them, or I say labor for them. Example, my sister used to be in human resources, worked for a company called Accenture. Best Buy, which I'm sure you're familiar with, they're headquartered in Minneapolis, did not have their own HR department at the time. Instead, they paid Accenture to come in and operate like the human resources workers would. They found that they didn't need to put full-time salaried employees there, so they outsourced that work. Now, there's also a term called offshoring, and sometimes when you hear outsourcing, that's instantly what people think of. Offshoring is when outsourcing is done, but that second firm operates in a different country. So then it leads to the next question is, why might politicians speak against offshoring but not mention the benefits of it? Because oftentimes when companies are offshoring, what they're doing is reducing their cost to produce goods, and thereby that ends up in the end making those goods more abundant and usually lower in price then, because we know if costs go down from back in level 2, the price of goods goes down. So the politicians, though, will sometimes have to focus on the jobs of their constituents that are the voters being displaced as a way to win the vote, and they might ignore that lower cost and the efficient production that ends up helping people throughout their voting district, because they have to weigh the benefits and the cost of how they're going to talk about offshoring, and they may very well decide that it's more beneficial to bring jobs back than it is to keep prices low. So that may be one explanation as to why politicians would speak against that. Oftentimes, politicians are going to do what they need to do to try to win votes, quite simply put. So this was a lesson about trade, and I thank you for your attention.